They found him slumped beside the broken piano bench. One hand still clutched a damp sheet of music, the ink smudged by rain. The other rested gently on a worn key, as if mid-note. No audience, no stage. Just an old man who'd played the same melody every Friday. Same hour, same station. He never missed a week, and no one ever asked why. Until that morning, when the sun caught the brass of his watch and someone noticed the name etched on the back. Before we go on, where are you watching from? Stories like this deserve to be heard, and I want to know who's listening. He came in before the lights, always the first to arrive, never in the way. Ernest Blake, 76. Quiet posture, hands worn thin from decades of tuning strings and tightening pegs. No one really noticed him anymore. The theater didn't pay him, not officially. He had stopped drawing a paycheck 8 years ago, after the funding cuts. But he still showed up every Friday. Same time, same routine. Polished the piano bench, wiped the dust from the music stand, adjusted the pitch on the baby grand like it still mattered. The stage manager once asked if he had anywhere else to be. Ernest just smiled and said, "This place still listens, even when no one else does." No one really knew what that meant. To the younger performers, he was background noise, a faded name on an old volunteer list. The woman at the front desk called him Mr. Keys. She thought it was cute. Most days he didn't mind. He moved like a shadow behind the curtain, respectful, careful not to draw attention. He brought his own tools in a leather roll older than the building, kept it wrapped tight, even when all he did was wipe the keys and leave. But Friday was different. Every Friday, after checking the locks and polishing the brass plaque in the lobby, he would fold his sleeves, grab a folded sheet of music from his coat, and disappear for 3 hours. No one followed. No one asked. He took the same path, down 3rd, past the bakery, across the bridge with the broken railing, and up the gravel hill toward the edge of town, where the station stood, Hillcross Station, abandoned since '92. Trains didn't run that way anymore. The old waiting room still held the smell of oil and dust. Most of the benches were gone, save for one, warped by time, still facing east. And in the far corner, half hidden behind a stack of crates and yellowed timetables, sat the piano. It wasn't much. A Wurlitzer upright, legs uneven. One of the pedals was broken. But every week Ernest opened the lid, brushed off the dust, and played. Always the same song, no lyrics, no name, a melody that lingered like breath on cold glass, fragile, steady, unfinished. Some weeks, he brought a thermos. Others, just his notebook and a tuning fork. Once, a teenage couple passed by the windows and paused. The girl said it sounded like a lullaby. The boy said it sounded like goodbye. Ernest never looked up. He played until the sun hit the far wall, then closed the lid, packed his things, and walked home the same way he came. Slow, straight-backed, coat buttoned to the neck. At the theater, no one knew where he went. They just figured he liked the quiet. But the janitor once said he heard him humming the tune in the hallways. Barely a whisper, but always on pitch. The melody wasn't written in any book. No title, no composer's credit. Not even Ernest called it by name. To him, it was just the piece. Simple, quiet, and unfinished. Like something meant to fade out, not conclude. But it hadn't always been that way. 50 years ago, in a place no one talks about unless they're drunk or dying, Ernest had played it once before. Not for applause, not for an audience. For survival. It was 1974. A jungle outpost. Rain every day. He was part of a small reconnaissance unit, attached unofficially to a communications division that didn't exist on paper. The radios had gone down. They were surrounded. No contact, no orders. And so one of the medics, a former music teacher from South Carolina, had pulled out a flute and asked Ernest, "You remember the one you wrote on the ship?" He had. He played it once, bare-boned and slow, on a busted signal amplifier repurposed as a speaker cone. The notes drifted through the treetops, not as code, but as hope. Hours later, a helicopter came. Only a few made it out. He never saw the medic again. When he came home, he burned the uniform, stored the composition in a brown folder, and tried to forget. He didn't tell his wife, didn't tell the VA. Didn't tell anyone. He opened a music school instead, gave lessons, tuned pianos, played backup at weddings and church events, but every time he touched the keys, that melody waited, just beneath the surface. His wife passed in '96, cancer. He sold the school the following year, and by 2000 no one really asked where Ernest Blake went. He drifted, until one day, walking past the edge of town, he saw Hillcross Station, boarded up, empty, forgotten, except for the piano. Someone had left it there, abandoned like everything else. He didn't ask how or why. He just sat down, opened the lid, and started to play. That first day, his hands trembled. He hadn't touched the piece in decades, but it came back, slow and steady. He played for no one, not even for himself. He played because it felt wrong not to. The station became his church, his confession booth, his graveyard. Each week he brought a folded copy of the same sheet, handwritten and yellowing. Sometimes he changed a note. Sometimes he stared at it for hours before playing a single key, but he never stopped coming. The only other person who ever got close enough to ask was Mrs. Delane, the woman who cleaned the theater's costume room. She'd once seen him putting the sheet back into his coat pocket and asked, "Was that yours?" He paused, then nodded once. "That melody, it's sad," she said. "No," Ernest replied, "it's unfinished." That was the closest he'd ever come to telling anyone. The video was only 17 seconds long, shaky camera, low resolution. No filter, no editing. Just a quick pan across the train station ruins, followed by a slow zoom on an old man seated at a piano. The caption read, "Creepy or beautiful? Found this guy playing in an abandoned station. Same time every week, they say." It was posted by a backpacker named Rachel Lynn, passing through on her way to a photo gig in the mountains. She hadn't meant anything by it, just thought it was a strange, oddly touching sight. By nightfall, the video had over 200,000 views. Some comments mocked the scene. Others asked if it was a promo for a horror movie, but a surprising number stayed quiet, tagging friends, sharing in silence. One user wrote, "Why does this feel like something sacred?" Another, "That tune, I know it. My father played it when he came back from Vietnam." By morning, the post had been re-uploaded by multiple accounts, one of which belonged to a military history group. And that's when everything changed. Because someone, somewhere in uniform, recognized not the man, but the melody. Ernest didn't know. He didn't use the internet, still mailed checks, still read the obituaries on paper. He didn't even own a smartphone, just a flip phone for emergencies, which hadn't rung in years. That Friday, as always, he walked to Hillcross with his folded sheet of music in one pocket and his thermos in the other. It had rained the night before. The grass was slick. He slipped once near the gate, caught himself on the handle, muttered something to the wind. Inside, he sat as usual, back straight, fingers lined up. But something in his body felt slower that morning, heavier. He began to play. Halfway through the first verse, he stopped, not because he forgot the notes, but because his vision blurred and a sharp tremor passed through his right arm. He gripped the edge of the piano, tried to steady his breath. He managed one more chord. Then everything went still. They found him an hour later. A jogger called it in, said he thought it was a mannequin until he saw the hand twitch. The ambulance came without sirens, just flashing lights. The paramedic who lifted him said he looked peaceful, as if listening to something no one else could hear. At the hospital, the nurses assumed he was homeless. No ID beyond a folded sheet of music and a city volunteer badge from the theater. They called the front desk. Mrs. Delane picked up. When they asked if she knew an Ernest Blake, she said, "He's not the kind of man you forget." Later that evening, while sorting his belongings for intake, an orderly found a leather-bound pouch tucked inside the lining of his coat. Inside, a brittle document dated 1974. A field note signed by a Marine communications officer, and a music sheet with 3 signatures and 1 red stamp reading, "Confidential Archive Copy." There was also a post-it stuck to the back. In Ernest's handwriting, one line, "Play it loud, if they ever ask." They didn't know what it meant yet, but someone would. The phone rang in a locked office at Fort Bennet. Major Sloan had been dozing off over a desk full of outdated paperwork when a junior analyst burst in with a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." At first, Sloan waved him off. Viral videos weren't his concern. But when the analyst pressed play, the room fell silent. It wasn't the man. It was the music. He'd heard it before, in an after-action report buried so deep it required 2 passwords and a retinal scan. A melody once used as an emergency signal in the jungle, back when radios failed and codes got men killed. A melody rumored to have saved over 20 lives in 1974. And now, 50 years later, it was being played, exactly the same, by a man no one had seen since the war ended. Within 48 hours, the Army's Archives Division, the Department of Veteran Affairs, and the U.S. Military Music Corps were all on alert. The video was triangulated. The jogger who called 911 was interviewed. And eventually, someone connected Ernest Blake to a service number long believed retired and a document labeled Deferred Recognition by Request, a clause no one had used in decades. That Sunday, Hillcross Station was no longer forgotten. Ernest woke to sunlight filtering through hospital blinds and a knock at his door. 2 men entered. Not doctors, not family, uniforms sharp, shoes polished. One had a silver cluster on his collar, the other a black case under one arm. "Mr. Blake," the taller one said. "May we sit?" Ernest blinked slowly, nodded once. "We're here because of a song," the older one added, placing the case on the side table. Inside was a laminated photo, grainy but clear. A field team, mud-covered, flanking a portable speaker system. In the middle, Ernest, eyes young and hands mid-motion. "I didn't think anyone kept that," he murmured. "We did," said the officer. "We just didn't know who to thank." Ernest looked down at the thin blanket covering his knees. "I wasn't the hero," he whispered. "I just didn't stop playing." "That's exactly why we're here," the man said. The proposal was simple. They wanted to hold a public performance. 1 song, 1 tribute. Not for Ernest, but for what he represented. A quiet act of courage. A melody that became a lifeline. At first, he refused, said he was too old, too tired, too late. But when the officer mentioned the name of the medic, the man who handed him the flute in 1974, Ernest went quiet. "How do you know his name?" "He wrote about you," the officer said, before the final push. Said if any of them made it out, it would be because of the pianist. Ernest turned his head toward the window. "I thought I was the only one who remembered." "You were," the officer said, "but not anymore." 2 weeks later, Hillcross Station was cleaned for the first time in 30 years. Weeds cleared, windows patched. The piano lifted carefully onto a mobile stage, tuned by the same tools Ernest had carried in his leather pouch. And on a gray morning before dawn, a military transport bus parked beside the station. From it emerged a full brass band in dress blues, tuning quietly under the mist. Ernest arrived with help. He wore a charcoal jacket, his old concert coat from the 80s, and a navy cap, slightly frayed at the brim. When the conductor nodded, the band began to play. The same melody, the same tempo, but this time it filled the space like a cathedral. Residents gathered along the tracks, veterans saluted, teenagers stood with phones lowered. The music didn't rise, it settled, into the bones, into the floor, into the memory of a place that had waited half a lifetime to be seen again. Ernest didn't speak, he just watched. And when the final note held in the air like smoke from a warm fire, he did something he hadn't done in over a decade. He stood and placed his hand on his heart. If you believe forgotten moments still matter, and that music can carry memory, consider subscribing. We tell stories for those who still listen. They gave him the envelope after the music ended. Not a medal, not a proclamation, just a folded sheet of paper sealed in wax, with a single word handwritten on the front. Return. It was his original score, the one he'd left behind after the last evacuation. Recovered from a bunker long since cleared, still bearing his initials and the note, for when sound matters more than orders. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just held it with both hands and closed his eyes. The city council voted unanimously the following week. Hillcross Station would be preserved, not as a museum, not as a tourist site, but as a space for music. The plaque above the entrance read, "In honor of Ernest Blake, composer of Silence Remembered." The piano stayed, cleaned, repaired, retuned one final time. His tools were framed behind glass next to a copy of the melody handwritten in charcoal pencil, still smudged where rain had touched it. But Ernest never returned. He passed 3 months later in his sleep. No pain, no ceremony, just a quiet sigh and a soft winter breeze slipping through a cracked window. The theater left his chair untouched for a year. Mrs. Delane kept his mug on a shelf in the costume room. Someone left wildflowers on the stage every Friday at noon. No one ever claimed responsibility. One morning, early spring, a group of students arrived at Hillcross as part of a field trip. Fifth graders, rowdy from the bus ride, tired of rules. The teacher asked them to form a line, single file, hands behind their backs. Most obeyed. But one boy, maybe 10, wandered over to the piano. He didn't sit, didn't touch the keys. He just stared for a long time. Then slowly, almost uncertain, he placed his fingers gently on the ivory and began to play. Not perfectly, not fluently, but the notes were there. Tentative, true. The teacher moved to stop him, but the docent shook her head. Let him finish. Outside, the sun rose just enough to catch the brass plate on the bench near the tracks. It read, "He played for those who couldn't speak. Now the music speaks for him." And inside the station, the melody filled the air again. Not louder than before, but no longer alone. If this story moved you, type melody in the comments. Your voice matters, and I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, here's your quiet reminder. Thank you for listening.